Today is Friday, February 28th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. A Hollywood icon has passed away, but the details have left a trail of questions. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can send us your thoughts as well if you'd like. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. That's our email address. We'll go right to our inbox. We'll check it out when we get around to it. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Joining me now to get through all the news of the day, CBN's Madison Seals. Madison, on the Focus story, you're taking a look at this new study that came out.
Yeah, Pew Research confirms Americans have become less religious overall, but it also reveals that this decline is slowing down. So there's good news and a good opportunity here.
All right, looking forward to the details on that coming up. Also, on the main thing, can President Trump bring peace to Ukraine and Russia? A former congressman joins us to discuss coming up on the main thing. All right, make sure you are subscribed to all of our CBN News podcasts. You can find the links to them right in the description of this podcast episode. And with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And Hollywood legend Gene Hackman, who is 94, and his wife, Betsy, were found dead in their Santa Fe, New Mexico home, according to authorities. Maintenance workers found the couple and one of their dogs dead after not seeing them for about 2 weeks. Police noted no forced entry, but found an open pill bottle, scattered pills, and a space heater near one of the bodies. So the circumstances were suspicious enough that they're looking at a deeper investigation. The remains of Hackman's wife showed mummification and bloating, while Hackman was found collapsed near a pair of sunglasses. No signs of carbon monoxide poisoning were found. The medical examiner is going to look to determine the cause of death. The investigation's ongoing, and the New Mexico gas company is assisting law enforcement in determining what happened. Hackman's a two-time Oscar winner, known for The French Connection, Superman, Unforgiven, and a whole host of more movies. In a bilateral meeting between President Donald Trump and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer at the White House yesterday led to the UK Prime Minister, or Trump, calling the UK a wonderful country and highlighting their strong relationships. The leaders talked about Russia, Ukraine, trade, and other global security matters. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. Madison, I mean, I know you're a little younger than I, but I'm not sure how familiar you are with Gene Hackman's exploits, but obviously a sad story because we don't know what happened here yet. Sad anyway, but it's got people wondering what in the world went on there. But interestingly enough, I just have Unforgiven is one of my favorite movies, and I have it on DVR. And so every now and then, once in a blue moon, I'll just watch the last like 15 minutes of that movie because it's just such a classic scene and classic ending. And Gene Hackman's in that, and he plays sort of this hard-nosed sheriff that's trying to turn around this country town out west. So anyway, I happened to watch that last night. Was one of the nights where once in a blue moon, I'll just turn it on and watch it. And last night was one of the nights. It's so odd to wake up to that news that Hackman had died. And just a bizarre story and a sad one.
Yeah. Well, interesting on your end. Yeah, that was the timing for when you chose to watch it. I definitely recognized the face. I didn't recognize his name at first, but after seeing images pop up, I'd realize how many things he's been in. And yeah, it is tragic. I mean, at his age and under the conditions that they found, it's sad for the family to not really have any answers. It's a tragedy nonetheless, but for there to be so many questions surrounding it, I'm sure is just awful for the family. And it just interesting too, with the situation of their pets, the fact that one of them had passed, but there was another dog that was alive indoors and one outdoors too. Just lots of questions surrounding this still, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Have you ever seen the movie Hoosiers?
I believe so. That sounds so familiar. Probably like a long time ago. I'm going to have to go back and watch some of these now that I'm going to be seeing his movies pop up everywhere.
Well, I mean, if your answer is I believe so, I'm going to say you didn't see it because, or you saw it when you were like 8 or something like that and you don't really remember it. But Yeah, that's one of my listen, I play basketball, so that's one of my sports. So that particular one is about it's a true story. It's based on a true story. And so it's a really cool story because basketball is so big out in Indiana. And he takes this really small town team with only not a lot of people in their high school, and they make it to the state championship. So very, very cool movie. And there's some interesting stories on that one in the background too. Like apparently he didn't think that this movie was going to be anything worth his while. And so he was miserable on the set, apparently, as the stories go. So, but then it ended up becoming one of the all-time classics. But yeah, I mean, we'll be praying for answers for sure, as to what happened and what went on. Hopefully the family, can get some closure on that whole situation there. All right, we are going to move over to the focus story now. As we just talked about a moment ago, this new study's out looking at the religious landscape of the country. And first of all, let's start, Madison, with what is this study and how often it's done and all those details.
Yeah, so this is the third time Pew Research Center has conducted a religious landscape study. The first was conducted in 2007 and the second was in 2014. So these results are in contrast to the past couple of decades, really. And basically, it takes a look at how people in the US self-identify themselves spiritually. And these results seem to suggest that the decline in Christianity that we've seen over the past few decades is stabilizing. And we can get into some of those specific numbers too.
What do the results say about the whole religious landscape here recently in the last couple of years?
So, first, it provides some kind of big picture numbers. 62% of US adults describe themselves as Christians, 40% are Protestant, 19% Catholic, and 3% are, identify themselves as other Christians. 29% are religiously unaffiliated. So 5% specify atheist, 6% agnostic, and 19% identify religiously as nothing in particular. 7% belong to other religions, 2% are Jewish, 1% Muslim, Buddhist, or Hindu. And some religious practices like prayer and attending church have mostly stayed the same over these surveys. About 44% of US adults say that they pray once a day, and 33% attend religious services once a month, which are actually much lower than I would have assumed, but those have stayed very consistent. But even so, even though those numbers are kind of low, large majorities of Americans say that they do have a spiritual outlook. So 86% believe that people have a soul or a spirit, and 83% believe in God or a universal spirit, which are very different things. So I don't know why those were equated, God or a universal spirit, but anyhow, 83% believe in something bigger. 79% believe there is something spiritual beyond the natural world. And 70% believe in heaven, hell, or both. So really interesting that those numbers are so high, even with a decline in overall Christianity.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think that that's kind of like a bridge. It's like a first step. If you already believe in something outside of yourself, well, then it's a matter of just seeing the truth of which belief that is. So that is interesting for sure. You went through a bunch of the numbers here. What are some of the key kind of findings and takeaways, big picture things here from this study?
Well, one thing that I've gotten from these results is that this splintering and kind of dividing of denominations over issues like same sex marriage and female leadership in the church over the past few years has not been beneficial to anyone. And it's probably largely affected how many youth stay in the denomination that they were raised in. And I think of like the United Methodist Church, which is definitely not united anymore. That's a great example of that. It used to make up 5% of US adults in 2007, and now it's down to under 3%. So I think that part of it's interesting. Also, the study does suggest we may see more of a decline in the future of Americans who identify with a religion because young adults are polling less religious than older adults, and there aren't any recent birth groups that have become more religious as it's aged. But of course, that doesn't mean that young people aren't searching for meaning in their life, like you said. And I think the high percentage with a spiritual outlook demonstrates that. So the tone of the results of this study seemed to be a positive one, that maybe the stabilizing of the decline is a perfect time for pastors and churches and Christians to be equipped and ready to feed people who are clearly spiritually hungry for truth and purpose, whether it's through a church service or something like a podcast that people can turn on in their car.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think when you look at the churches that are growing and which ones are experiencing growth versus decline, I think you'll find that the ones that are seeing more people attracted to them are the ones that are really doubling down on the truth of Scripture and not just the fluffy, ear-tickling, winsome sort of language that some churches, at least maybe even back in the day, like people just wanted their ears tickled. That was kind of a mode for culture a few decades ago, where it was just tell me what I want to hear, make it easy, make me feel good. And now I think people in an age, as you were kind of alluding to there, Madison, where basic truths are being questioned so many times, I think people are yearning for, and we see this all the time with the younger generations. What do they want? Authenticity is kind of the word they want to hear, right? You don't tell me the fluffy thing that's just going to sound good. Tell me the actual truth I want to know. And so instead of trying to, beat around the bush like some popular pastors want to do right now and say, well, we need to make a message that's welcoming to all. Like, no, just let Scripture speak for itself. Speak the truth of Scripture and let the chips fall where they may. And it's funny because, Madison, you're probably familiar with Beckett Cook, who we've had on CBN, different shows a few times. I've interviewed him, and he's, somebody from Hollywood who was in the LGBTQ lifestyle. And what turned him? What got him? What was it some big argument? Was it fluffy messaging? No, it was a couple of Christians doing a Bible study at a coffee shop who just mentioned the church they went to when he was going over there to try to sort of embarrass them. And they ended up essentially inviting him to church. He goes to church and he just listens to the pastor bringing Scripture in the service that day, and God did the rest. So I think as Christians, that's kind of where we need to go when you look at the trends that are happening right now. But interesting stuff for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that is a great point, that the denominations that have stayed consistent with the truth have seen growth, or at least have stabilized. And I think another thing that speaks to is that young people want stability, and they want to see conviction for people's beliefs, in a denomination that's swaying back and forth on the issues, that doesn't show a real sense of conviction in what you believe and passion for what you believe. So that's definitely an important element. And I think one other stat that was maybe not the most surprising, but still interesting, is that 66% of adults who attend religious services say that most or all people in their congregation have the same race or ethnicity as they do. And when those same people attended as children, that number was a little higher. 78% say that was true then, but it's really not that big of a difference in numbers. So I think it's interesting to see the percentages haven't changed much, even in the years after many churches held CRT trainings and pushed DEI initiatives on staff and even on their congregations too.
Yeah, that is interesting for sure. And something to keep an eye on. And I'm sure we'll be giving updates whenever more surveys like this come out. And we do see a few of them a year. So appreciate you taking a look at this one, Madison, and breaking it down for us here on the podcast today. All right. We are going to head over to the main thing now. And President Trump has been trying to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia. Will he be able to do it? Former Florida congressman and former U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, Francis Rooney, shared his thoughts on that and more with CBN's Gary Lane. That conversation is today's main thing.
The leaders of France and the United Kingdom paid U.S. President Donald Trump a visit in Washington this week. Trade and tariffs were high on the agenda, but much of the discussion centered on ending the war between Russia and Ukraine. Here with more is former Florida congressman and former ambassador to the Vatican, Francis Rooney. Ambassador Rooney, President Trump has received a lot of criticism for the way he's treated Ukrainian President Zelensky. So is he justified?
Well, yeah, I think he is. I mean, Zelensky should have known better than to mix it up with the President of the United States, okay? He's living off of us. It has been since this thing first started. And I think a growing number of Americans want to find some way to terminate this thing instead of continue to dish out billions.
Well, the British and French are proposing a European force of peacekeepers to be placed in Ukraine and backed up by the U.S. military. So what do you think? Do you think Trump will go for that? What are your thoughts on that proposal?
Well, I agree with some of the things Trump has suggested, that there's no role for NATO in this, and that the Europeans need to provide the security arrangement to the Ukraine. It's their territory. It's their fight.
Well, so what do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I think that's a deal Zelensky's going to have to take.
Well, he's already said that he would be willing to negotiate some kind of deal on precious metals there, on some of the metal wealth in Ukraine with the U.S. What do you think of that one? Because we've spent, as Trump said, $360 billion on Ukraine.
I think that was a great idea. I mean, Trump's a business guy. You know, he says, we've given them all this money. Why they've got all these assets. Why don't we get some of them?
Well, and some people say that they haven't accounted for at least half of what we sent them. What are your thoughts on that?
You got to remember that before all this started back in 2016, Ukraine was considered one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Their borders were notoriously famous for thievery and things passing through without tariffs and contraband getting through. And that's why Trump upheld the missile shipments in 2017 until they kind of cleaned up their act a little bit.
Well, I saw one report that suggested Boris Johnson presented a peace proposal to Zelensky and Putin in March of 2022, a month after the war started. Zelensky rejected it. Is that true? And if so, why do you think he would reject that when he could have ended the war a month after it started, sparing hundreds of thousands of lives and that massive destruction to his country?
I've heard that both Macron and Johnson talked about some peace solutions, not without technical details. But the problem for Zelensky is he doesn't have the horsepower to try to do what he's trying to accomplish, and he doesn't seem to want to admit that. If he thinks he's going to get Russia out of Crimea, he's living in some alternate reality.
Yeah, I think most people don't think that's ever going to happen. So how does this war end? Zelensky says he'll step aside if Ukraine is allowed to join NATO. So isn't that one reason why Putin invaded, that and EU membership?
Well, I don't think we have any business expanding NATO anymore. There's a legitimate question of whether we've already expanded it more than the American people would support their treaty obligations for.
So why do you think we want to expand it then?
I don't think we do. Okay. I don't think we have any business letting the Ukraine in NATO. I think that's going to be an absolute requirement of Putin, that and staying in Crimea. But I think, maybe there's a solution more like the North and South Korea deal with a European peacekeeping force and a border there in the Donbass somewhere, Crimea, and everybody goes away peacefully instead of more the Hitler into Czechoslovakia solution.
So you don't see NATO membership for Ukraine happening. So what security guarantees could be given short of that without U.S. troops? Just Europe or?
Yeah, I think the Europeans, I think it's kind of their fight.
So do you think it's better for us to talk with Russia or to ignore Putin?
I always think it's better for leaders to talk. I mean, you can't solve anything without communication, and you can't have any kind of relationship without communication. That doesn't mean anything will go very often, or maybe never. But the fact that Trump and Putin can discuss this now, where there hasn't been any discussion for 4 years, is a major improvement. Well, there's bound to be a way for a solution to be had that includes Russia keeping Crimea, no NATO, maybe Zelensky gets back a little bit of the Donbass.
Well, I was going to ask you, what does Russia need to give up? After all, this war is really a stalemate. There's no clear victor.
Yeah, but I think that the cards are pretty well on the table that the longer this thing goes, the more Ukraine will suffer more than Russia.
And I can't let you go without asking about Pope Francis. He's in critical condition at the age of 88. You were ambassador to the Vatican. Your thoughts on his papacy and potential successors?
Well, his papacy has certainly been a little more liberal than his predecessors. The two John Pauls and the Paul VI, and then Benedict, who I was fortunate enough to serve with. He's taken the church in a much more liberation theology direction, more focused on North-South dialogue and discrepancies of wealth instead of doctrine. And hopefully we'll get someone that will go back to being a little more theological and doctrinaire. I'm kind of rooting for Cardinal Parolin, since Parolin was the guy that I talked to maybe 4 days a week the whole time I was over there, and his job is being in charge of all the ambassadors in the Holy See Secretary of State. And I've stayed in touch with him, and every time I go to Rome, I go have a nice meeting with him, and it'd be fantastic if he got in. He's super smart, and he's not a super liberal like this Pope, but he's not probably as conservative as Benedict.
Okay, we're all praying for the Pope, I'm sure. Ambassador Francis Rooney, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
All right, Gary, appreciate that conversation there. And that's going to leave us with time on this Friday edition of the Quick Start podcast for one last thing.
Today's verse is 1 Peter 3:15, which says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." This is a good reminder that no matter what is going on in our culture, we should never lose sight of our mission on this earth to share the gospel, and the way we do it with gentleness and respect is just as vital as how prepared we are with the truth of the gospel.
Absolutely. And also, too, implied there in that portion of scripture is that we should look like a people who have hope. So we should look differently, first of all. So in order for anyone to ask you for the reason for the hope you have to stand out as someone who actually looks different and looks like they have hope and looks like they are at peace when things are crazy, or however else you can stand out with your faith. So yeah, first you have to go about living your life like that. But then, like you said, when when we are asked about it, we need to do that with gentleness and respect, but not yielding at all to the truth and pointing people to Christ. So a good encouragement heading into the weekend. And as always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com. A lot of news from a Christian perspective over there. And Lord willing, that creek don't rise on us. We'll be back here on Monday with more. God bless. Have a great weekend.